tardes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to this joint event with the School of Education and Asian American Studies. And we're very fortunate and delighted today to have a very important guest speaker, Stacy Lee, who's a professor of education policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an affiliate of the Asian American Studies program. And Stacy has a long list of publications, but she really studies the intersectionality of race, immigration, and schools, and has published two important books in the field. And I think the talk today is based on her new work that she's doing with Hmong students in Wisconsin. So with that, let's a nice Zatzal welcome.
Introduction. Thanks to the School of Education and Asian American Studies for inviting me here to talk with you today. I thought, actually, you did a nice introduction to what I do, but I'll just say just a little bit more and then launch into the study. So my research focuses on the role of education in the incorporation of youth from immigrant families into the United States. My research is basically split into two kind of interconnected strands. The first strand focuses on the role of schooling and the racialization of Asian American students from immigrant backgrounds. And then the second strand looks at schools and community-based organizations and their responses to immigrant youth, particularly looking at educational policies and practices. And I've done a number of projects. Today I'm actually going to talk to you about kind of ongoing research on Hmong students in Dane County. This research actually intersects my two lines of research. The larger project, which I'll just give you a little bit of background before I talk to you about sort of the very specific slice of the project that I want to talk to you about. So the larger project focuses on Hmong and other Southeast Asian American youth. We're interested, my grad students and I are doing this work together. We're interested in the messages that Hmong and other Southeast Asian American youth are receiving from their co-ethnic communities, their families, from community-based organizations, and from schools about their identities as Hmong or other Southeast Asian youth and their identities as students. We're also interested in how dominant racial discourses shape understandings of who Hmong students are and what Hmong communities are, and how Hmong youth and Hmong communities are negotiating these racial discourses. The study is in its second year. It is a sort of a three-phase project. In phase one, we've been talking to community leaders, Hmong community leaders and parents, focusing on how they view children's education and the policies and practices that they advocate for. Phase two focuses on community-based organizations that work with Hmong youth and the messages they give these youth about who they are and about schooling. We focus on two community-based organizations and two different programs. And phase three, which we're just now starting, is school ethnography. That's actually what I normally do, school-based ethnography at high schools. We've gotten access to one high school. We're trying to get access to a second high school in town, the two high schools that have the largest Hmong populations. So that's the larger sort of context for the slice I'm going to talk to you about today. Today's focus is going to be specifically on how Hmong American leaders in one community in Wisconsin are making sense of and responding to the racial positioning of the Hmong American community, and how their responses to racialization shape their actions, specifically their actions around educational advocacy. So I'm going to just give you a heads up about what my argument is before I get into the kind of some of the data. I'm going to argue that the Hmong American community struggles with both invisibility and hypervisibility, a situation that I'm also going to argue is common to Asian American communities more generally. Invisibility is linked to the dominant discourses around the sort of discourse around race that is black and white, that renders the experiences of other groups largely invisible. Hypervisibility occurs for Asian Americans when they are framed alternately as perpetual foreigners, dangerous, and or as hardworking, self-sufficient model minorities. While seemingly oppositional discourses, Asian American scholars have discussed these images as two sides of the same coin, both working to uphold white supremacy and undermine interracial solidarity. With respect to my Hmong participants, they certainly experience invisibility, not being recognized, and part of that invisibility is because of the model minority stereotype, actually. They also struggle with hypervisibility, That is the idea that they're foreign, they're backwards, they're deficient, and because they're unable to achieve the monolingual status. So that's the first argument I'm going to try to make. The second argument that I'm going to make is the strategies used by the Hmong American community leaders to negotiate their invisibility are related to their own class positions and or their class aspirations. And finally, I want to highlight how their negotiations and understandings of race influence their educational advocacy. In other words, how they go about advocating for their children, their students, and the kinds of programs they're advocating for. So, this is ethnographic in design. Just to give you a little bit of background, Wisconsin has the third largest Hmong population in the nation, obviously California having the largest, in Fresno largely. The Twin Cities of Minnesota having the second largest, Wisconsin having the third. One of the things that makes Wisconsin a little different than the other two states is that the Wisconsin community, Hmong community, is really spread throughout the state. Right? We are talking specifically, our work focuses specifically on Dane County, where there are 4,230 Hmong people living in Dane County out of approximately a total population of 510,000. So it's a relatively small population. Dane County itself is the home of the largest university in the state, the flagship university. It's known for being a relatively progressive community. It's been touted as a wonderful place to live with outdoor activities and good schools and good liberal politics and all that kind of thing. It is also, however, known for having a very, very significant racialized achievement gap. This was brought to the attention of the larger community. This is something that those of us who study schools have known about for a very, very long time. But it was the Race to Equity report published in 2013 that really brought this to the attention of the larger community. The Race to Equity report, which looked at 2012-2013 school data, revealed that 42% of Dane County's African American high schoolers failed to graduate on time, compared to 12.7% of white students. African American students, in other words, were 3.3 times more likely to miss this key benchmark than their white peers. The Race to Equity report drew important attention to the educational injustices faced by the African American community in Dane County, but it didn't really focus at all on other communities of color, though the authors did recognize that Latino communities and perhaps Southeast Asian communities also were experiencing inequalities. So our work is an effort to kind of enter the conversation by focusing some attention on Southeast Asian students. So this is a team-based ethnography. I'm doing this work with 3 of my PhD students, and so I wanted to give them a shout out. Linda Feng is a second-generation Khmer American. Jewel Zhang and Mai Meng Vang are 1.5 generation Hmong Americans. This is how they identify themselves. For me, this was very, very important. I had done work with the Hmong community and on the Hmong community for many, many years, and had stopped doing the work in large part because, well, for 2 reasons. One, I thought that there weren't any stories more to tell in Dane County. Right? That was one story I thought. Turned out I was wrong about that. The other reason was that, frankly, I'm not Hmong, and I really felt that as we have seen more Southeast Asians and Hmong folks in particular entering higher ed and starting to become researchers, that it was time for folks to do research in their own communities. In other words, it's a political stance, right? When the Race to Equity report came out and there was still silence around Southeast Asians, I started kind of thinking, well, maybe there's really room to do this. And I started talking to my graduate students, and they're like, you definitely should do the work. And I'm like, well, maybe we should do it together. And this actually allowed us to do things that if I were frankly doing it by myself, I couldn't. It's not just that there are more people to do more field work, right? But it's also that we have folks on the team who are bilingual in Hmong, bilingual in Khmer, so they can speak to elders in ways that I could not, right? And so we're able to be more places, but we're also able to reach different populations. So that was really very, very important to me politically. So in the sort of typical ethnographic design, we're doing participant observation, interviews, analysis of site documents. That would include everything from local newspapers to school district reports and policy reports to school district data, to websites from basic community organizations, ethnic newspapers, all those kinds of things we're trying to get through. Right? As I said, we're in year 2, At this point, we've done approximately 200 hours of ethnographic field work. Data that I'm going to talk about today is drawn largely from the interviews with community leaders. We've interviewed 12 community leaders, as well as some of the data comes from observations of youth and community leaders in community centers, in school board meetings, and other public spaces. While members of the dominant society in Dane County often refer to, quote, the Hmong community and the Hmong community leadership, as if the Hmong community represented a single entity, we quickly learned that the term community leader is ambiguous and contested within the community. So that's actually one of the first things we actually want to say, right? What does it mean to be a community leader? Who's a community leader? This is not a simple question to answer, right? There are indeed the elders who people go to for things like family issues, like divorce and those kinds of issues, ceremonial kinds of things. These would be the people that only my students really can really interview, because I don't have the language fluency to actually talk to that group. Then there are the kind of college-educated professional Hmong Americans who are leading kind of a lot of this work that I'm going to be talking about today. Then there are people who do more kind of grassroots progressive kind of leadership. So there's the community is not singular in in the way they live, in the way they understand their situations, in what they want, and who they look to leadership, right? So that was one of the very first things that we sort of we found. Okay. I guess it probably is also worth noting that we've intentionally called out Dane County as a space, in part because we wanted to be in conversation with the Race to Equity report. Ethnographers tend to typically use pseudonyms for space and place and people. We are with a kind of newer generation of folk, we're kind of pushing that and saying, there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not that should be done. I can talk more about that if people are interested. We made the decision here to actually name Dane County, but not to name specific cities, but obviously people can probably figure things out. We are using pseudonyms for people and for organizations. And we figure also that as slow as this work is to take, maybe so much people we've gone and done other things. No. Anyway, okay, so, all right. Invisibility. So across social class backgrounds and political perspectives, our participants expressed a concern about the relative invisibility of the Hmong community. In our formal semi-structured interviews and in our fieldwork, participants expressed concerns about the lack of awareness regarding who Hmong Americans are and the concerns the community faces. Participants regularly remarked that, quote, people don't know who Hmong are. They think we are Chinese or something. Our voices aren't heard. The way Hmong leaders responded to concerns about invisibility, however, varied and were linked to class aspirations and racial politics. Our middle-class professional Hmong American participants pointed to the exclusively black and white discourse in the Race to Equity report as evidence that the Hmong and other Southeast Asian communities are largely invisible. Mr. Lee, a middle-class community advocate who works in higher education, compares the relative invisibility of Hmong Americans in Dane County with the visibility of the black community. So this is a part of what he says. He says, us Hmong, I think they do face discrimination. And also, they don't have enough support. First, it's not a priority. And secondly, budget cuts, right? So if parents, the community is not vocal about it, then it's, no news is good news, right? They just don't pay attention. If they don't need, then the Latinos and the blacks vocalize daily that their kids can't learn, they're falling behind, then they focus more attention on the blacks and the Latino kids. Middle-class participants argued that the school district data hid the problems faced by Hmong students. In particular, they believed that the aggregate data that the district collected on Asian American students supported the idea that Asian Americans were all high-achieving Hmong minorities. And this aggregate data rendered them invisible. So in 2013, Mr. Tao, a college-educated middle-class leader in Lakeview and a founder of an educational advocacy group that I'm calling Hmong Education Advocates, or AGA, worked with one local Dane County school district to come up with a system to disaggregate the Hmong student data within the district. The disaggregated data from the 2015-2016 academic year revealed that the vast majority of Hmong American students in the district are identified as English learners, 88%, though almost all are US born. And 76% are eligible for free or reduced lunch. The data also demonstrates that while Hmong American students have relatively high graduation rates, 80%, high attendance rates, 94.8%, and low behavior events, that is disciplinary issues, 8%. They score below district averages in math and reading proficiency in grades 3 through 8. Armed with this data, HEA has argued that the disaggregated data demonstrates that a large number of Hmong youth are trapped in ESL and graduating from high school with limited academic skills, which make them vulnerable for being trapped in poverty and low-paying jobs. By calling for disaggregated data, Mr. Tao and HEA were engaging in a strategy advanced by many critics of the Hmong minority stereotype. But as educational researcher Uyan Pun and her colleagues have argued, the focus on ethnically disaggregating data on the Southeast Asians has had an unintentional impact on contributing to the reproduction of deficit thinking and the reification of the model minority stereotype. In fact, while our middle class participants are concerned with invisibility, they're also concerned with the kind of visibility or hypervisibility that the Hmong community has endured in the past. Specifically, they express concerns with the negative, their language, stereotypes facing the Hmong community, including the reliance on public assistance among Hmong families, youth gangs, early marriage among girls, high school dropping out of school among boys. Not insignificantly, these are stereotypes that have been linked to what I referred to in my earlier work as the ideological blackening of Hmong youth, an idea that I sort of build on Iowa All's book. Thus, for middle-class community leaders, the dilemma is how to fight invisibility without contributing to the deficit narratives of the Hmong community. Their strategy involves highlighting the ways the Hmong community is indeed model, and then turning the conversation around from what the Hmong community lacks to what the system fails to give them. So this is a dilemma that we've seen, my students and I have seen kind of the community kind of play out on several occasions. I was at, and this is actually just impromptu, we were at a conference where a Hmong professor was really kind of raising this very problem. And he really tried to argue that, yes, indeed, the way that we've been presented to the dominant group in the past as is in these very deficient kinds of ways, but he says that's really a very partial picture of who we are. And he starts to go through about kind of how they were loyal, soldiers fighting with the CIA against the communists, basically crafting kind of a narrative that they are indeed, in his language, ideal citizens. So we find this very interesting and curious in ways that we're arguing that they're trying to kind of pick out aspects of the model minority discourse and build on those, right? So, pointing to the high attendance rates and the low behavior events, for example, Ms. Mua, a middle-class professional who co-founded a summer program for Hmong American children and youth in Dane County, explains the dilemma of invisibility faced by Hmong students, and I quote, "Our kids are on a double-edged sword because we teach our kids to be respectful. Don't challenge teachers. Don't ask too many questions, right? And then when they go to school, they don't, act out. So they seem, when they go to class or school and they're not absent, so they're here, so that's good enough. They're behaving. So they don't get the substance of the material, but they're behaving. So with that, we continue to get high graduation rates. That puts an edge, right? But they're not preparing our kids for higher ed because they don't have the deep substance for higher education." So what she's really getting at here is that she recognizes that Hmong American students haven't achieved the model minority academic success that other Asian American kids may be achieving. But she's also trying to emphasize that Hmong American families value education and do indeed teach their kids to behave. She's trying to draw on aspects of the kind of behavioral aspects of the model minority stereotype, right? To emphasize that they are indeed deserving. It's also curious, I think, that while she doesn't explicitly compare Hmong students to other groups, she does suggest that other groups may be indeed getting attention because they're acting out. Okay. So in addition to drawing on the model minority rhetoric regarding behavior, middle-class Hmong leaders argue that the school system has failed to see or recognize their culture and community. Reflecting what political theorist Nancy Fraser refers to as the politics of recognition, their educational advocacy is focused on calling for cultural and linguistic representation in the community. Okay. Mr. Tao, for example, argues, we believe the lack of cultural competency, only one certified bilingual Hmong resource teacher in the entire school district, lack of culturally relevant pedagogy, not having programs to support Hmong students that produce positive self-awareness, self-confidence, and pride in their home language and culture, and lack of support for Hmong community overall in the district are the main contributors to the low scores, right? So he's really kind of flipping it. We are not being recognized. That is why our kids aren't doing well in school. He goes on to compare the invisibility of the Hmong community with the greater visibility of the African American and Latino communities in the city. And I quote again, while the Urban League and United Latinos provide services to their respective communities, the Hmong community has no such direct service organization. With limited or no funding from the larger Lakeview community for programs designed to address Hmong assimilation and self-sufficiency, the Hmong community feels isolated and students and parents are disconnected from the schools. In the half dozen or so occasions that I've had the opportunity to meet with and talk to Mr. Tao, he's talked about the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy for Hmong students repeatedly. So I finally asked him, so where'd you get this idea about culturally relevant pedagogy? He said, well, I heard other groups talk about it. So then I Googled it. And he says, and it turns out, because I Googled it and read more about it, and Dr. Ladson Billings is the one who does this work. I'm like, yes, she's my colleague, right? So what's curious, though, is that he's very savvy, right? He's picking up on kind of how other leaders in other sort of ethnic and racial communities are kind of advocating. He's picking up that same discourse. He's getting online. He's figuring out how to kind of push for his community. Like many who embrace the discourse of culturally relevant pedagogy, however, Mr. Tao focuses on cultural competence, but does not pick up the focus on more critical aspects of culturally relevant pedagogy that Ladson Billings actually talks about, right? So Ladson Billings also, because Gloria and I are friends, said, I often go into schools where they say they're doing culturally relevant pedagogy only not to be able to recognize what's actually being done, right? So there's kind of this sort of superficial attention to culture, but no attention kind of to looking at structural inequalities, which is also central to what she argues culturally relevant pedagogy should do. So again, Mr. Tao is sort of picking up, and I think this is intentional, is basically what I'm trying to get at, right? That he's trying to sort of push for things for his kids in ways that are palatable to the dominant group, right? So in short, Mr. Tao and the members of HEC and the larger middle-class Hmong leaders attribute the academic struggles among students to the lack of recognition. Right? And they're calling for culturally relevant pedagogy and bilingual ed. Significantly, they're calling for a recognition of their distinct cultural and linguistic heritage and rarely speak about working with other Southeast Asian groups or other groups of color. They want Hmong culture, language, and history to be taught in schools. They position themselves as the voice of the Hmong community and have worked hard to build social capital with university-level professors as well as district-level administrators. Their efforts have led to the disaggregating of Hmong data, a collaboration between HEC and the school district for a summer program that serves Hmong elementary school students, and have also contributed to the recent approval of a Hmong developmental bilingual education program at one elementary school, which I can talk a little bit more about later if you're interested. So I want to turn to the next story. The low-income Hmong Americans and what I refer to as kind of the politics of resistance and the politics of redistribution. While middle-class Hmong Americans have become increasingly focused on the educational disparities facing Hmong American students, the most economically disadvantaged members of the Hmong American community struggle to meet their basic needs, and our data suggests that their voices are largely absent in the achievement gap conversations. Ms. Her, the leader of a group we call Shout, an organization that represents, in their language, low and no income Hmong, Cambodian, and African American families, remarked that it's difficult. It's one of our first meetings with her. She clearly did not trust me, and she actually said, I'm only talking to you because I know you're one graduate student. Right? And she said, and I was asking questions about schooling and educational achievement and things like that, and she looks pointedly at me and she says, it's difficult for families to advocate for education when they don't have access to food and housing. So a very different perspective than Mr. Tao, who anytime I want to talk to him, he wants to talk to me because he's actually also trying to get information from me. Right? Most recently, we put in a grant together for this community university relationship kind of thing because he literally called me literally the day it was due, and he said, so-and-so backed out, you've read the grant, would you put it in with me because you need a faculty sponsor. I talked to my grad students. I thought, well, we really can't say no because we're working with these communities. It's a great idea, But I think his approach is very different, right? He's like, what I want. We have class aspirations for the middle class, for not only for them, but his family, but for the community. What can I get through building social capital with people like you, right? As opposed to people that Shout, who are like, who are you? What do you want from us? You come and you take, and what do you have to give, right? So when we've talked extensively with them about what we might be able to do in terms of workshopping with the kids and things like that, frankly, what they wanted supplies, right? They didn't want our expertise, right? That was like, so they wanted pads of paper, they wanted pens, they wanted materials, right? So we used some of the grant money that I had to get some of those things. They now are more interested, now that we've known them for a year, they're like, well, maybe you could run a workshop on stereotyping about Asian Americans. But at first, when we offered those things, they're like, no, we don't need that, we need money. And they ask, do you have seeds, money for our elders to buy seeds to plant gardens and things like that. So a very different perspective is what I'm basically trying to get at. Like our middle-class American participants, our low-income Hmong American participants are concerned about the invisibility of the Hmong community. Me, a youth coordinator at Shout, expressed her frustration regarding the way the Hmong minority stereotype masks the concerns of the Hmong people. She says, and I'll read the longer quote here. I still think that a lot of people don't know who the Hmong folks are. I think that a lot of people still think that we're like East Asian, Chinese folks, right? And that we fit into this model minority myth. Yeah, I think that, they think about Hmong, I think they think the model minority folks, right? Really try to put us in that box. But I think if we look at the statistics, right, and we take out Southeast Asian folks, that when we look at it, we see that Southeast Asian folks are the complete opposite of the model minority. That we're not doing well at all. We're actually really poor. We're not graduating from high school and college. All of that, right? So me and other members of Shout argue that efforts to perform a model minority image on the part of the middle-class Hmong community damage both the Hmong American community and the Black community. Me goes on to say, and I quote, the model minority stereotype is just feeding into the system of white supremacy. Not only that, but the model minority myth is very anti-Black. Everything about the model minority myth is being white, becoming white, and being the furthest thing from Black. We should not try to be the model minority at all. It's like we're trying to fit into the system. And the system is just using the model minority as a tool to keep us down so that it can keep working its magic. So Me's critique of the model minority stereotype is linked directly to an implicit anti-Blackness in the discourse. She recognizes that the model minority discourse is implicitly comparative in nature and that there can't be a model minority without a problematic minority. Me and other youth workers and the youth at Shout have developed close relationships with the low-income Black community in Lakeview through their work in Shout. Living and working in the same communities, Me has seen firsthand the ways that race and class intersect with other identities in the lives of low-income communities, and she's come to believe that low-income Black and Southeast Asians face shared forms of marginalization. Me and other members of Shout argue for an intersectional approach to challenging the multiple forms of oppression faced by members of the low-income Black and Southeast Asian communities in Dane County. Thus, Me's critique of the model minority stereotype is based on her commitment to building cross-racial coalitions with other low-income communities of color. So while Mr. Tao believes in the power of education to help individuals and communities achieve social mobility, Ms. Her, Me, and other Shout members question the role that education can play in addressing inequalities given that schools are largely reproductive institutions that support white supremacy, her language. Like Mr. Tao, Ms. Vang, the head of Shout, is a college-educated woman, but she remains committed to working with the Hmong who live in low-income housing. Although she's highly critical of schools, she believes in the importance of critical education, and she and her colleagues at Shout engage youth in deep political education in their after-school programs. Their educational ideas, however, are based on ideas from the Freedom Schools and from Frere, very different from what Mr. Tao is doing in his summer program. In terms of educational advocacy, Shout is involved with working with youth to address what they describe as the, quote, racist disciplinary practices in school, including the police presence in schools. Expressing what Fraser refers to as the politics of redistribution, Shout members demand Black community control over police and other institutions. While Mr. Tao meets with district-level administrators to negotiate change, Shout encourages Hmong and Black youth to engage in active protest. In addition to literally taking to the streets, they regularly take groups of youth to school district meetings to protest. During recent field work, Dua, one of my students, right, had the opportunity to ask Ms. Her what she thought of the newly approved plan to open a DBE Hmong program at one elementary school in the city. Ms. Her explained that she didn't support the new Hmong bilingual program because it was first developmental and not dual immersion, and secondly, because it was only available to kids at one school. She went on to criticize both the district and those who might support such incremental change that she believes ultimately supports the status quo, right? So the argument, right, is that you have two very different political perspectives, two very different sort of understandings of where they want to, what their end game is, and kind of two different approaches to educational advocacy. So, in conclusion, lots of time for conversation. Right, so there, this was the slide I should have pressed before. This is what Shout wants. So in conclusion, what I'm trying to argue here is that while both the middle class and low-income participants are invested in advocating for the Hmong American community, they take very different approaches that reflect their different class positions and class aspirations, different racial politics, different understandings of the root problem, in other words. For middle class participants, the dilemma is about how to make visible the concerns facing Hmong Americans without contributing to a deficit discourse. Their negotiation of the model minority stereotypes, specifically their attempt to position their students as exhibiting model minority behavior, suggests that they recognize that being cast as model minorities is a form of symbolic capital and expression of relative privilege. Their demands for recognition are always couched in the language of culture and cultural maintenance rather than race or racism, a strategy that appears to be intentional and based on a desire to work with those in power. It's important to point out that our middle class and Hmong American participants are crafting a strategy for advocacy that involves framing the concerns of the Hmong American community as largely distinct and separate from the concerns facing other communities of color. Here, they're implicitly drawing on a discourse that Asians are neither black nor white, but they're also stating clearly that they're not just Asians either, they're Hmong specifically. Finally, they're interested in working within the system. And while frustrated by incremental change, they're willing to go with incremental change. In contrast, our low-income Hmong American participants, those in Shout, for example, view the invisibility of the Hmong American community as being linked to racism and class inequality, and they're more concerned with the redistribution of power and resources than they are about simple recognition. They see the concerns faced by the low-income Hmong community as being tied to those faced by the low-income Black community, and their critique of the model minority stereotype is based on a larger critique of white supremacy and a commitment to cross-racial coalition building with Black communities. As such, their educational advocacy centers on issues that affect the Black and Southeast Asian communities. They reject incremental change as reproductive. So, the differences between the middle class and low-income participants and how they make sense of and respond to inequality point to the complex and important ways that class aspirations shape responses to racializing forces. For educators, our research highlights the diversity within ethnic communities in ways that should caution school districts working with immigrant communities to make so that they make efforts to reach out to multiple segments of communities. So, plenty of time for questions. I always so I under this time, but that's okay because that leaves time for questions. That's all I have. Thoughts?
Could you comment on the low and middle income Hmong participants? Did they are they clearly differentiated on from where they immigrated, or at what time they immigrated, or?
Mr. Tao and his wife, who I can't remember what I call her, but I also quoted her. They came over quite early. 1976 he came over, very, very early. And they were privileged in Laos and were resettled very, very early here. Mr. Tao was settled in Iowa in a very, very white community. We had a really interesting, one of my really interesting conversations with him. He's going on and on about culturally relevant pedagogy, how important it is for people to kind of understand who they are. And then he also talks about having grown up in Iowa. So this is a man who, in a very, very white community, and he also has a graduate degree in physics. And has been quite successful economically and clearly achieved kind of the American dream, as it were. Right? So, I've known him long enough at this point to say, I don't know, some people might actually look at your story and suggest that kind of a really kind of press for really rapid assimilation is what's really necessary. Opportunity and a press for assimilation. What would you say to that? Why is culturally relevant pedagogy so important? By the way, I actually think it is, but I was really curious to see what he would say. And his response was, you can be successful but dead inside. You can hate yourself, and that's not a life worth living, right? Yes, I went right to college, but I see my kids, and I see how they struggle to feel proud about who they are. I remember struggling that way myself. Kids shouldn't have to feel like that. They shouldn't have to feel dead inside. I think if they're just recognized and their culture is respected, they will do better in school, and they will also simultaneously feel better about themselves. But it is interesting. Yes, you got onto something really important there, is that he came with the first wave of Hmong folks from a privileged background, and that is actually something that's talked about within the larger community, right? Before my graduate students and I realized that he and his wife were somewhat controversial figures within the larger community. This is, you're kind of bumbling around in field work. You ask people, do you know people? What do you think of what they're doing? And we got a sense early on that there was something going on because people were kind of shut down. They didn't want to be critical, but they also stopped talking, right? So we're like, Then as we got to know people better, they said, well, they think they're better than we are. His father was a teacher in Laos, so he's from the educated class, right? So I think there are class differences in some ways that transferred from Laos. So that is important. Yeah.
How large is the Laotian, Cambodian, or even Vietnamese community in Dane? Is there a larger non-Hmong?
No, Hmong is the largest Southeast Asian community in Dane County.
Okay, so there's not other. Okay.
There's a small Khmer population. No one knows the figures there. People say there's an undercount. We haven't actually gotten any Khmer people in our study yet, making Linda Feng, my Khmer student, really upset. She's like, we can't. Why won't anybody sign my consent form? Right. So very, very small. Hmong is the largest Southeast Asian population in Wisconsin, actually.
In the whole state?
In the whole state. Remembering that Wisconsin has the third largest Hmong population in the country.
And pretty much that's in this area, in Dane?
No, they're all over.
Before,
Yeah, they're all over. Which also makes for really interesting kind of dynamics within the larger Wisconsin Hmong community. What they have done is they have each large community, let's say Dane County, let's say Wausau, let's say Green Bay, Appleton area, will take a different month or week of a month as their Hmong New Year. Right? So in Dane County, the Hmong New Year is celebrated the same weekend as Thanksgiving every year, even though that's not when it is. That's when Dane County does it. And I said, well, that's curious. Why do they? And they said, because families travel to all of the Wisconsin New Year's, and some folks even come out to Fresno to go, right? And they don't want to compete. They want people to come to their celebration. So, and those celebrations are organized more by kind of the elder generation, more than by the leadership that we are that I talked about today. Yeah.
Has there been an effort to reconnect with Hmong in Laos?
So, I can't remember what I call it, but the Shout people, they're actually taking a group of people over winter break to Laos. She goes all the time. She's, I can't remember what I call her, I can only remember her real name. That's the horrible thing when we're just starting to kind of play with the data, the early data. One of the reasons that she's controversial is that she came from a very, very poor family, lived in public housing. She was the first Hmong woman in the community to get accepted to the flagship UW. So everybody put a lot of hope in her. She was quite successful as a student. She got into a graduate program, but she very quickly determined that her politics weren't suited for staying in graduate school. She felt that basically graduate school was basically a consent to white supremacy. Again, looking at me when she said that. So she left and she started doing basically domestic violence work within the community. Okay, so that's actually how Shout started. She worked with Hmong and other Southeast Asian women who were victims of domestic abuse. This became highly controversial within the community because the elders in the community in particular felt that that was kind of an inside problem, not something that white folks should know about, right? But she went and she looked for money from dominant institutions, so she's been going back to Laos and other areas in Southeast Asia to really work with what she says is kind of a hidden problem in the United States of Hmong men going back and trying to find child brides, right? And we haven't actually gone down that road with her yet, but she mentioned it in the very first interview. I think she was basically trying to say, you're asking a lot about school, but I got more serious stuff on my plate. I've got people who are homeless, I've got people who are hungry, I have women who are being beat up, right? So your school talk is nice, but, you know. So then I had to recalibrate, how do I get it, because I was really interested in what she was doing, what she and her group were doing with young people in their after-school programs. And access is everything. So I was like, okay, I'll back right up over that, talk about school. But, so we don't, anyway, she does that kind of work, which has made her very, very controversial. But she has a lot of connections to Southeast Asia. Now, Mr. Tao and his wife have also gone back. They went back last winter break. They took their 3 children who had never been back. But was curious because when I spoke to his wife, whose pseudonym I can't remember what I call her, I was really struck by how she spoke about it in very much the ways that any middle-class parent might speak about taking their kids somewhere. It was educational. It wasn't so, there was some talk about kind of connecting to culture, but it was very much kind of educational, right? And one of the things I remember her saying, and this stuff hasn't been fully transcribed, so this is just kind of really from memory, she said, I wanted them to know where I was from, where we were from as a people. I also wanted them to know how lucky they have it in the United States. So it's a different discourse than the Shout people would have, right? Which I think is really interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
So when you said you were talking about the data, so I was just interested in why is the graduation rate, you said 80%,
Mm-hmm.
but their math or science scores so low, but how did they get to that graduation rate?
So 88% of them are stuck in ESL.
Mm-hmm.
So these are US-born kids who have been in this school district, most of them their entire careers. So we know if they started kindergarten in ESL, really a good ESL program should not have them in ESL in high school. Right? I mean, that's not. We know from the larger body of literature on ESL placement, the work by people like Rebecca Callahan and things like that, the quant work, right? That long-term placement in ESL has negative academic consequences, right? You don't have access to rigorous academic content, you don't have access to college prep AP classes, right? You might graduate from high school, and so this is what Mr. Tao and his group say. We graduate from high school, that's good, but we graduate in high school without the kinds of courses that we need to get into the UW, without the kinds of training to leave the working class and the poor. Right? So again, this is unanalyzed, not even transcribed data. Last week, a couple of my grad students and I we were interviewing folks at the school district. Again, untranscribed. But they asked us, so what are the parents saying? And I said, well, I can't tell you individually what the parents are saying, but I can tell you the story that we hear consistently. And that's one of the stories we hear kind of consistently across groups is they're not happy about their kids being trapped in ESL. And that's actually true, on both the kind of Shout side and the Mr. Tao side. If they agree on one thing, it's that. Why are we trapped in ESL? Right? So I said, so they're not happy about being trapped in ESL. So they got immediately defensive. So I asked my grad students afterwards, was that just me or was it? Like, no, that was really weird. And they were thinking, well, they felt like the parents didn't understand what ESL services were. Right? And they didn't understand that there was good and bad ESL and, and I'm like, yeah, but if they're still trapped in ESL in high school and they've been in the district the whole time, that might seem like bad ESL. Didn't say it quite that directly, but They're like, well, we recognize it across the district, it's uneven, we have schools that are doing remarkable things, and we have schools that are doing things very poorly. To which I also thought, but as a researcher did say, well, you gotta fix those problems then, right? So that's the concern. They're graduating, but they don't actually have the academic background to be competitive to go on to college, or at least for, four-year colleges, which is what at least Mr. Tao wants for his kids. They also, the district people talked about the fact that many of the ESL teachers are actually intentionally holding their kids back because they fear that their kids will not do well in mainstream classes, which of course is consistent with the research, but I would suggest that's a bigger problem with mainstream classes. The answer isn't to hold kids back, the answer is to address what we're doing with mainstream teachers. One of the things we've been trying to do at Wisconsin is address how we train all teachers such that all of our elementary and secondary certification programs have gone to dual cert programs, right? Content area certification and ESL certification, so that everybody gets out knowing something about how to work with second language students. So that's the answer, not holding kids back. So, was there, yeah.
I just have a question, my question is mainly for your research, how has it influenced the policies, recommendations, and reforming school policies?
So we're not done?
Yeah, just as how it relates to the school to prison pipeline. Just with your work so far, how has it changed with working with the C community in terms of reforming those different policies in place? Or if you can share any ways how your work has influenced organizations and groups and action and mobilizing with each other. Yeah.
So I guess I would say, I have to emphasize, this is ongoing research, so we have not had any impact yet. What we hope, my students and I hope, is that through having ongoing relatively transparent conversations with the district, that we can have some impact as we're still collecting data, right? Saying this is what we're hearing from the community, these are the kinds of things they want, these are the kinds of things they don't want, right? So that's not big level, it's for this one school district, but we are still we're still collecting data, right? In other lines of research, I guess I would say that, so I don't know if I want to go there. Another one of my lines of research is on newcomer high schools for immigrant English learners. That work, my colleagues and I are done collecting data. We're done, the grad students have transcribed and coded everything, but we're still writing off of that work. So these are high schools that serve low-income immigrant students who are newcomers to the U.S. around high school. They're all English learners. These are kids who generally don't do well in school, frankly, right? So in New York City, this is a demographic that graduates from New York City public schools at around 30% for the graduation rate. These high schools have a very, very good success rate in getting these kids to graduate from high school. So I did a few projects in the school looking at what is it that they're doing to try to figure out, are there things that they're doing that we can then learn from them to transfer to other places. As an ethnographer, one of the things I would say is that we get in deep at the local level, right? And we would argue that you have to understand the relationship between the local level and the district level, the state level, the federal level, right? All those kinds of things. The local level in New York City is really different than the local level in Wisconsin. Right? There are no big cities like that. The context is different. Even if the federal policy level context is the same, the state levels are different, the region and the populations, everything is very different. So I guess I would argue that my work suggests, that line of research suggests things that schools in districts like New York City might be able to do, but has much more limited ability to be transferred to what small communities in Wisconsin might do, right? Because the context is different. And I would actually say that's both the limitation, but also the strength of qualitative work. Good qualitative work is supposed to make things more, reveal the complexities, right? So I could go on and on about that, but I fear I might get on a soapbox, so I won't go there. There was one hand in the back, and then,
No, I think you addressed
Okay.
the question about that issue of holding them back in ESL being a very systemic problem,
Uh-huh.
and being able to say, oh, with the high graduation rate, to continue to support that discourse of invisibility, and not having to focus on addressing any of the issues or challenges with the students,
right,
or informing their families and their parents.
yeah. And so that's the kind of feedback that we tried last week to give the district. This is what we're hearing, this is what they're concerned about. And it was a really interesting meeting because I thought I actually was very neutral in my, well, this is what we're hearing, kind of non-judgy, as it were. She immediately got defensive. And I thought, well, we have to, right. But they're district level politics too, right? I mean, I think as she continued to talk, we were there a couple hours. There were 3 of them, but the head person did most of the talking. I think a generous interpretation, and I think it requires more field work, is that these are people who really are trying to advocate for English learners. They work in a bigger system where they're also strapped for resources and support, right? And they feel like they're actually trying to help these kids. They know the problems, and somebody's just telling them what they're not doing right. And yet they're the ones who care about kids, and they would say other people in the district don't even care about these kids. So, I mean, it's complex, right? I mean, I think that they probably do care, but they have to understand at the same time that care alone does not educate these kids. Your concern alone does not translate into opportunity. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that because of the feedback that you're giving them, do you foresee facing more or heightened resistance to the work that you're trying to do, or being shut out in different ways? Or do you think that they'll come around and actually try to change?
I just got an email from one of the women asking me for something, so I figure we've still made nice. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, you don't know what they're up against either.
Exactly,
They're
right.
taking stuff back.
That's partly what I'm trying to say, right? Kind of looking at the complexity of all the systems, right? We'd have to go back to IRB if we wanted to kind of look higher up the food chain, as it were, in the district. That might be something that's worth doing. We keep running into things where we want to know more. But we've also have run out of money, and so now we have to apply for new money, which is a whole nother job. So, you do that, you can't spend the time in the field. So we're trying to balance, like, how far do we want to go, which directions, that's right. What's your name, Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you could get a little more, I mean, you talked early on about kind of the Hmong being rather dispersed throughout the state, and by implication, I heard throughout the county as well. But I wonder I'm just curious about spatial distribution of both the community and then kind of the ways that perhaps what I heard in the talk, and again, you can correct me if I'm completely wrong, that there was some level of segregation that was kind of happening in terms of kind of where some of these students are being placed in terms of schools. I just was wondering about between the two groups that you talked about.
So Dane County is experiencing significant kind of demographic shifts, right? Becoming much more racially diverse than, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. We have, my colleague Lynn Posey-Maddox does work on demographically changing communities. One of the communities she looks at is in Wisconsin, Dane County. Her focus is on African Americans who are moving up from Chicago, right? So we have a small but significant growing African American community, a very significant growing Latino community, and then a Southeast Asian community that's staying relatively stable. It's not really growing significantly. It's pretty much stable at about 4,200 people. Most of them are actually within this one district I call Lakeview, which is the biggest district in Dane County. Some folks are moving out to some of the suburbs. Both some black folks and some Southeast Asian folks are moving out to a couple suburbs where housing is less expensive. And we have started to try to make connections in those places to see whether or not among students, are faring differently in those communities. We're just now making some connections. Our sense from the early connections, but we don't yet have permission, right, is that the stories kind of similar. Trapped in ESL, largely invisible, that sort of thing. So, but it's really, really preliminary, and we're not sure we're going to go that way because we have limited resources, we've run out of money. If we apply, we have to figure out which are the stories that we think are most important to pursue, and tracking them to the suburbs is probably not where we're going to go. Though it's important to point out that some folks have gone there. Does that answer your question? I would also say that about Dane County is that we are so what I'm getting at is that it's a relatively racially diverse county, but neighborhoods that's where we're going. Neighborhoods themselves are very, very segregated. And so for the Hmong community, not the middle class folks who've moved into basically white communities, frankly, right? They're located where there are low income housing, right? So there's a pocket of low income housing in the south of this one city that I call Lakeview. There's a pocket of low income housing in the north of the city that has Hmong folks. And there's a small pocket in the southwest that seems to have one or two families, right? So they are kind of spread out. Public transportation is not fabulous. I mean, there is a bus system. But one of the issues that Shout faced was that they were trying to reach poor kids, poor Southeast Asian and Black kids all over the city. And they did not for the longest time, for years, for over a decade. They ran out of an office that was like a small bedroom, right? And so all of their after-school programming and stuff, they would have to rent from other people or use the public library and things like that. And then transportation was an issue. So they would have me, actually, I do remember what I called her, she would literally drive around and pick kids up, take them to the public library, they'd have their event, then she'd literally drive them back home. So this isn't really sustainable, right? And you really can't grow programs that way. They did finally open up a new space in the summer. They opened a new space in the summer, first time they've ever had their own space like this size. And interestingly, even though they don't talk the politics of recognition, they are connected to their culture. The place was blessed by Hmong elders, Khmer elders, and Black elders. Right? But it's a multiracial space. It's a very, yeah.
Are there any efforts to connect to the Latino community, especially given kind of immigrant background or bilingual education?
Interestingly, no. And I think it mostly has to do with, if you look at the middle class community, they're not interested really in connecting to anybody other than for basic information. They see their issues as largely separate. They're friendly with, folks. They're friendly with other middle class kind of professional folks of color, but they don't really coordinate tightly, right? And then the Shout group, I think they wouldn't have any problem reaching out to the Latino community if the Latino community actually lived within the same housing complex that they. But right now, it's Black folks and Southeast Asians, and that's what their history has been.
Stacey, what about the relationship between the Hmong and other Asian communities within that?
So they really do, like in the middle class folks, they really would say, they're quick not to say anything bad about anybody, right? But it's what they also don't say as well as what they do say. They're very much, it's a Hmong thing, it's a Hmong thing, it's a Hmong thing, right? The Shout group works very closely. They would very, very, very much be open to any Southeast Asians. They work pretty closely with the Cambodian temple. I can't remember what I call her, but the domestic violence work that she does includes Cambodian women. So she does do that cross kind of ethnic as well as cross-racial work. They also do, interestingly, and I did not mention this, Shout also does work with the LGBTQ communities. And one time I was talking to Mr. Tao, and we were talking about kind of relationships between and among the Hmong community. And he said, well, their group does a lot of stuff that really the traditional Hmong community doesn't really support. And I said, well, what would that be? Right? Knowing, of course. He said, well, they do a lot of stuff with the Black community, and they do a lot of stuff with the LGBTQ community. And so he draws then, at that moment, on the discourse of tradition. Right? What's interesting, of course, is that I think that's kind of strategic essentialism, basically, at that moment. Because he also pushes back against the traditional folks for not doing enough to advocate for their kids in school, not being involved enough in school, right? So it's, I mean, it's strategic, right? It's I know you had your hand.
Yeah, so you mentioned disaggregation and the disaggregation of data kind of shining this light and the dilemmas that arise from that. I wonder if you could speak a little bit of the narratives that are kind of emerging, and is there even kind of the thought, do we want to disaggregate the data based on what's coming out of it and what it tells us?
Well, for years, many of us, myself included, have argued that the Asian American category is incredibly diverse and incredibly complicated, and that the aggregate data can in no way, you know, do justice to revealing that complexity and diversity, right? And that the educational needs, for those of us who are specifically educational researchers, the educational needs of many of our kids, Asian American kids, are not being recognized because they're lost within the aggregate data. So we call for disaggregating the data. Mr. Tao and his group for years called for the district to disaggregate the data. They for years said they didn't have the resources to do that. They didn't do those kinds of things. They weren't doing it for the Latino community, though the Latino community is not as ethnically diverse at this moment, right? But in other words, the district's response is, we don't disaggregate the Black community, we don't disaggregate the Latino community, we don't do that, right? And Mr. Tao's like, yeah, but you know, you don't think there's a problem, and I think there's a problem, right? And you know, without being able to prove there was a problem, he couldn't get the district to move on anything, right? So he had to prove there was a problem. So Uyeon Poon has argued, she's an educational researcher in Chicago at Loyola, argues that the unintentional kind of consequence of pushing for disaggregated data and kind of pointing to the fact that Southeast Asians are often underachieving is that Southeast Asians have become the kind of face of the failed model minority, right? And that leads to deficit perspectives about who they are. It fails to recognize the diversity within those communities. I think it's a reasonable, concern, right? I think it's an important critique. There was a lot of debate when her piece came out within the Asian American ed kind of circles. There was a lot of debate. I actually think it's a reasonable concern, right? But I think that what the Dane County experience demonstrates is you can't push for things without the data. The data then may show that you are somehow failing. That then puts you at risk for a deficit discourse like the ones that unfortunately surround too many African American communities and Latino communities, right? Mr. Tao and other middle class folks in this community at least are very aware of that though, right? And they're trying to strategize to figure out how they can get what they need for their kids, and not just their middle class kids. In fairness to Mr. Tao, he's not just worried about his children because he could do that, and they go to different schools, right? They don't have, right? As his wife said, I'm in that school all the time. They know to run when they see me, right? She has a master's in social work. She knows how, she has social and cultural capital. She knows how to advocate for her kids. In fairness to Mr. Tao, and he's trying to advocate for some of these low-income kids that he sees as, his co-ethnic group, right? How do you do that without adding to this? And so part of how he does it is he's like, well, we are model in some ways. Look how well behaved we are. I would actually argue that that's problematic, but I understand why he's doing it. I think it's an acknowledgement of the kind of racial position that Asian Americans are actually in, right? He then very smartly, his group, kind of flips the conversation from what we don't have to what we don't get. I think that's a really smart strategic move, right? For a small community to basically say, our low numbers are the result of what you don't give us. Our low numbers are because you are trapping us in ESL. right? He's also frustrated by the fact that the DBE has only been approved in one school. He had pushed for actually he had pushed for dual immersion. In fairness to him, he had pushed for dual immersion. I can't get an answer from anybody at the district level as to why they didn't go dual immersion for Hmong speakers when they have gone dual immersion for Spanish speakers. My hunch, but I have no data, is that they don't believe white folks will buy into dual immersion in Hmong, right? I had one district level person kind of hint at that, but not willing to come out and say it on the record, right? That they don't believe that they'll get buy-in from the white middle class community. They won't tell Mr. Tao that. Mr. Tao thinks that's what's going on. He's pretty savvy, right? He's like, they're he feels they're kowtowing to the white middle class, but he's careful. He doesn't want to sound like he's trying to ride that line of being critical, but not too critical, because he needs the white folks to buy in order to get what he needs from his community. In many ways, he's much more constrained, right, than the shout people who don't care. They simply don't care what white people think. They'll just say whatever's on. I mean, they don't care what I think. They don't care, right? So they have a lot of freedom to express themselves. That said, I think they do really interesting work with the kids they serve, but they don't have a relationship with the school district. They are not seen, and when they are seen, when they show up at organized events, they're just seen as kind of troublemakers. They're not seen as part of any kind of organization. So.
Well, we've passed our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming.